The fact that pioneers and explorers to Africa were fascinated by African bodies to the point of over-sexualization is well documented. It can be seen in artwork such as this, and this, and this, and this. You get the point. Before the transatlantic slave trade, black women had long been depicted by early European travelers, explorers, and traders to Africa as especially fertile and hypersexual, a view that was used to justify sexual contact without consent. Even though I will focus on the sex slavery of the American South in this video, slavery itself as an institution existed in every human society throughout history. In fact, the word slave originally referred to the Slavs, who are Caucasians, people of European descent. Wherever slavery existed, the raping of slaves also existed. In fact, wherever people have been vulnerable, such as during the time of war, sexual assault has been committed against them. In the slave plantations of the American South, both enslaved men and women endured violations of their bodies and a general lack of consideration of their privacy. They were scrutinized, groped, and objectified by their enslavers. At slave auctions, black women were sometimes paraded with their bodies exposed to advertise their potential to have children. Stripping enslaved people to whip them was a common sexualized humiliation added to corporal punishment. In addition, enslaved people often were provided with inadequate clothing. This exposure contributed to their vulnerability and their sexualization. Traveling in 18th century Virginia, Francois-Jean de Castelou recorded seeing, and I quote, young Negroes from 16 to 20 years old with not an article of clothing but a loose t-shirt descending halfway down their thighs, waiting at table. In the 1859 case George vs. State, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled that a black enslaved man could not be convicted of raping an enslaved woman because it was not a crime. Since by law slaves were property, raping a black enslaved person was legally equal to having sex with a fruit or a vegetable. Because of the absence of legal protection, historians lack an archive of legal cases to determine the extent of sexual violence against the enslaved. Many historians have relied on first-hand narratives from actual slaves, such as those recorded by the Slave Narrative Collection. These interviews culminated in more than 2,300 first-hand accounts of slavery and 500 photographs of former slaves. While doing my research for this video series, I took the privilege of reading some of those accounts, particularly pertaining to the sexual assault of the slaves, and I will share them with you. Harriet Jacobs, a black slave, wrote, "My master was, to my knowledge, the father of 11 slaves. But did the mothers dare to tell who was the father of their children? Did the other slaves dare to allude to it, except in whispers amongst themselves? No, indeed, they knew too well the terrible consequences." Here, Harriet is saying her master, a white man, fathered 11 children through raping his female slaves and then enslaved those children, and those who dared to talk about it, especially in public, would face bad consequences, ranging from being beaten to being killed. Reverend Israel Massey, who was born into slavery in Emporia, recalled that enslavers and overseers would, and I quote, send husbands to the farm, milking cows or cutting wood. Then he would bed the slave himself. Some women would fight and tussle, others would be humble, fearing being beaten. Elizabeth Keckley, who was born into slavery in the Piedmont region of Virginia and taken by her enslavers to North Carolina, told in her narrative of being repeatedly raped by the son of a wealthy plantation owner who lived nearby. Eventually, she gave birth to a son that he fathered. In 1826, students at the University of Virginia raped a 16-year-old enslaved woman and later stripped her naked to beat her for giving them a venereal disease, as recounted by Alan Taylor in Thomas Jefferson's Education. Sexual violence was also perpetrated inflicted on male slaves. For example, in a 1787 incident in Maryland, an enslaved man was sexually assaulted when he was forced at gunpoint by two white men to rape a free black woman. Fighting back was usually futile, as those who resisted would be whipped or sold to a plantation in the lower South, separated from their families and consigned to a life of even harder labor. Nonetheless, some enslaved people did resist, self-emancipating, fighting back, or in extreme cases, resorting to the murder of their abusers. Enslavers had a financial interest in the enslaved people's reproduction, as children born to enslaved women would also become slaves from birth. They called this natural increase, and it made many slave owners rich, especially in Virginia and some states in the Upper South. What made slave breeding a lucrative business was the fact that when the transatlantic slave trade was banned, meaning there was no fresh supply of slaves from Africa, it made it more profitable for the enslavers to sell their surplus slave labor to the booming cotton states of the Lower South. In 1832, during a debate over slavery in the House of Delegates, James H. Golson of Brunswick County compared enslavers' right to the increase of their enslaved women to that of the owner of brood mares, and noted that this increase consists of much of our wealth. During the same debate, Thomas Jefferson Randolph noted that 8,500 enslaved people were exported annually from Virginia to the Deep South, and said it is a practice and an increasing practice in parts of Virginia to rear slaves for the market. I know their English is a little bit old-timey and hard to understand, so I will explain. Basically, what these men were saying during an official political debate is their economy, meaning the southern economy, depended on the breeding of more slaves, and since the transportation of new slaves from Africa was now illegal, they were promising their voters that if they get elected, they will make sure to protect the breeding of slaves as if they are livestock. Historians disagree about how systematic forced reproduction was, but it is clear from oral histories and other first-hand accounts that enslavers did engage in the practice. James Green, who was enslaved in Virginia, was quoted saying his master would pay slaves to breed. His actual words were, and I quote, "Master chooses a wife for every man in the place. No one has a say as to who he was going to get for a wife. All the wedding ceremony we had was master's finger pointing out whose wife was whose." Will Ann Rogers remembered that her mother, who had been enslaved in Virginia, told her that her owner mated slaves like animals. Sam Everett, enslaved in Virginia, recalled that, and I quote, "If there seemed to be any slight reluctance on the part of either of the unfortunate ones, Big Jim, the slave master, would make them consummate this relationship in his presence. He noted that this brought sadistic pleasure for the enslaver beyond the profits to be gained. He enjoyed these orgies very much and often entertained his friends in this manner. Quite often he and his guests would engage in these debaucheries, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young women. Enslaved women were commonly referred to in terms that reduced them to their reproductive capacity, using words such as fine wench or a good breeder when being sold at auction. By the way, fine wench means a good prostitute. Similarly, some enslaved men with imposing physical builds were used as stockmen to impregnate a number of the women with no regard to family connections, meaning they would force a son to have sex with his mother or a father with his daughter, siblings and cousins with each other. Inbreeding was popular before the scientific disadvantages were discovered. One slave, a well-built black man, recounted being forced to reproduce reproduce with 15 women and fathered dozens of children. In some cases, slave masters would allow the slaves to choose their own partners, but even then, there was still coercion at work. Teenage slaves were aware that women who failed to reproduce were devalued substantially and often sold away from their families. This pressure made them get into sexual relationships before they were ready. Enslavers encouraged enslaved women to bear children in subtle and in not so subtle ways. Many provided pregnant and nursing women with extra food rations and reduced their workloads. Some slave masters were known to make small presents to enslaved women when they had a baby as a thank you for making them richer. In 1792, a Virginia enslaver named B. Talbot promised an enslaved woman named Jenny that he would emancipate her and her sixth child if she would bear him 5 children, which, according to Deborah Gray White, he did in 1803. Long-term relationships between enslavers and the enslaved people also occurred throughout the era of slavery. As historian Brenda Stevenson noted, these relationships varied from rape and sodomy to romance, from chance encounters to obsessions, concubinage, and even marriage. Although not all white male-black female relationships were exploitative, most began that way and most continued that way. For many enslaved women, acquiescing to the sexual desires of their enslavers was the best among several bad options, including being physically punished until they relented or being sold off if they continued to refuse to submit. Some women made peace with their situation, knowing it would result in better treatment, such as working in the house as a domestic servant, which meant relative safety for themselves and their children. In fact, Harriet Jacobs, the first slave woman I quoted, entered into a long-term relationship with a neighboring white man just so that she could stop the repeated advances of her slave master. Such relationships were extraordinarily common, as noted from contemporary recollections and from the high percentage of mixed-race people in the antebellum South. Listen to this powerful passage written by Mary Chestnut in her diary. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children. And every lady tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own household she seems to think dropped from the clouds, or pretends so to think. It reveals in this passage that it was an open secret that male slave owners would rape their female slaves, producing a huge population of mixed-race people. As Brenda Stevenson, a historian, notes, based on an analysis of the 1850 U.S. Census, Virginia had the largest number of mixed-race enslaved people of all the southern states, totaling 44,299, or just over 10% of the enslaved population. Light-skinned enslaved women were particularly vulnerable to sexual predation because they were viewed as prettier. They could be caught up in the fancy trade, also known as sex slavery, often selling for as much as a skilled male laborer. In her records, Miss Stevenson wrote about Emily Russell, an enslaved girl who was placed on the market for $1,800 in 1850 by the Alexandria-based slave trading firm of Bruin and Hill, destined for sale as a prostitute in New Orleans. White women also engaged in sexual relations with enslaved men. As with enslaved women, some light-skinned men often found themselves the particular target of such sexual exploitation. Richard Hinton, a white abolitionist, testified to the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission that, and I quote, "I have never encountered a light-skinned, formerly enslaved man who has not told me of instances where he was compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." As Thomas Buckley found in his analysis of divorce in the antebellum Virginia, roughly 9% 80% of Virginia's divorce petitions from 1786 to 1851 were for interracial adultery, with 23 of those petitions coming from white men who complained that their wives had relationships with enslaved black men. Peter Nelson, traveling in Virginia in the 1820s, recorded that he had learned about a planter's daughter having fallen in love with one of his father's slaves, and that she is the one who had seduced him. In those days, it was very risky for a male slave to make any sexual advances towards white women, as it was an offense punishable by death. So the seduction, whenever such relationships occurred, was the other way around. Knowing the risk that if caught, only the slaves got punished, black male slaves were usually reluctant to sleep with white women, as white women were notorious for denying the consensual nature of the relationship. Some of these women would lie that they had been raped. In rare cases, these white women and slaves would fall in love and run away to the northern states, or find a way to live together in a world that had made their relationship illegal. Sexual exploitation was but one weapon used by enslavers to keep enslaved people subordinated and degraded. Enslavers benefited in many ways from the violations of black men's and women's bodies, including through physical and emotional gratification, reaping the power of the victimizers and the monetary profit associated with the reproduction of the enslaved. It is important to note that sex slavery still exists and happens in our world today. If you would like to help stop it, I have added a link to the description of this video with a list of charities that work around the world to stop human trafficking and sex slavery. Thank you for watching.